How do you capture the history of the Adventist Church in a territory that encompasses nearly 500,000 square miles? How can a few stories of a handful of people properly represent a church of more than 813 churches and companies with 223,422 members, who come from dozens of different cultures and worship each week in approximately 30 different languages? How do you summarize in just a few minutes the story of God's providence over 150 years? What are the milestones of God's leadership and grace? Hello, I'm Connie Vandeman Jeffrey. Each week we bring you stories of things that are happening in the Pacific Union that show how God is working in our lives and in our churches, schools, and homes. But what about, as the old phrase goes, how God has led us in the past? Do we have a history of providence for the growth of the Adventist Church here in the Pacific Southwest? Oh, yes, we do. Our communication team here in the Pacific Union sat down and picked out just a few of the stories that help us remember how abundantly God has blessed us and led us. The first Adventist in California was Merritt G. Kellogg, the oldest son of J.P. Kellogg. He came across the plains in a small wagon train in 1859, and after settling in San Francisco, he began sharing his faith. In October 1865, Merritt Kellogg and a few believers from San Francisco sent a call and $133 in gold to the General Conference, asking for evangelists to be sent. The GC replied they could not send anyone immediately. However, it seems they did keep the gold. Kellogg continued to press the case for the West, even traveling to the General Conference session to make a personal appeal. J.N. Loughborough and D.T. Bordeaux answered and arrived in 1868, packing a big tent for evangelism, and we were on our way. Dispatched as missionaries to the West by the General Conference, J.N. Loughborough and D.T. Bordeaux, along with their spouses, arrived in San Francisco by boat on July 18, 1868. Within a month of their arrival, they launched a series of tent meetings in Petaluma at the invitation of an independent church. They then proceeded to hold meetings in 4 more communities in Northern California. As a result of their work, the first Seventh-day Adventist Church in California was established and organized in Santa Rosa in November 1869. Charles M. Kinney was born a slave in 1855 and was 10 years old at the end of the Civil War. As a young man, he worked his way west to Reno, Nevada, and it was there on July 30, 1878, that he attended a meeting conducted by J.N. Loughborough. The guest speaker was Mrs. Ellen G. White, and she preached a sermon Kinney would never forget. Baptized on the last day of September, he became a charter member of the Reno Seventh-day Adventist Church. In 1883, church members in Reno, together with the California Conference, sent him to Healdsburg College, now Pacific Union College, for further education. Kinney became the first ordained African-American pastor in the Adventist Church. He worked initially in Kansas and then throughout the South with great success. Adventist evangelism among the Asian community began in the 1890s in California. A Japanese convert, T.H. Okahira, had been baptized after public meetings in Paso Robles, California, in 1892. He then went to Healdsburg College, and as a student there, he led out in establishing the Golden Gate Japanese English School in San Francisco. In 1894, at the close of the school year, he appealed for a volunteer to go with him to take the Adventist message to Japan. The president of the college, W.C. Granger, responded, and in 1896 they went as the first missionaries sent by the General Conference to Japan. In 1907, Okahira and H. Kuniya became the first ordained Japanese ministers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Okahira took part as a delegate during the General Conference sessions of 1913 and 1936. His son started the first Japanese church in Los Angeles. In 1899 in Sanchez, Arizona, Abel and Adil Sanchez had discovered while studying their Bibles that the day of worship was the seventh day, Sabado. They learned that Marcial Cerna, the pastor of the Tucson Mexican Methodist Episcopal Church, had become an Adventist through the work of Adventist colporteurs, and they contacted him. Eventually, so many of the Methodists in Sanchez became Adventists that the Methodists gave them their church on the condition that the Adventists helped them build a new one. And the church in Sanchez became the first Hispanic Adventist church in the U.S. Pastor Cerna continued to share his newfound beliefs with those he knew in Tucson, and many of them became Adventists, forming the second congregation of Hispanic believers. The following year, the Methodists deeded their church in Tucson to the Adventist group. Marcial Cerna was granted a ministerial license by the General Conference and so became the first Hispanic ordained Adventist minister. John Burden, along with his wife Eleanor, had worked as the manager of the Rural Health Retreat and was instrumental in establishing Warunga Sanitarium in Australia, as well as the sanitarium in Glendale. Mrs. White challenged him to find a suitable property for an additional sanitarium in Southern California, and Burden found a large and beautiful property in Loma Linda. The purchase was opposed by the General Conference, who in a telegram instructed him not to proceed with the purchase. Ellen White immediately and directly countermanded these instructions, telling Burden to, quote, secure the property by all means, without spending time to ask the advice of the brethren, end quote. The College of Evangelists opened in 1906. Ruth Janetta Temple began her studies at the College of Medical Evangelists, later Loma Linda University, in 1913. She was the first African American to graduate from the institution when she received her MD in 1918. Temple received a scholarship from the City of Los Angeles Health Department to pursue a master's in public health at Yale University. Dr. Temple became the first health officer of Los Angeles City in 1942, later becoming the city's director of public health. Elder H.M.S. Richards began his radio ministry on October 19, 1929, and launched the use of mass media by Adventists for proclaiming the gospel. H.M.S. Richards, Perez Marcio, William and Virginia Fagel, George Vandeman, Walter Ortiz, C.D. Brooks, Milton Peverini, Dan Matthews. These Adventist broadcasting pioneers either began or brought their ministries to the Pacific Union, and for some 90 years media ministries have flourished in the West. The global youth movement known as Pathfinders was nurtured and developed in the Pacific Union. The first conference-sponsored clubs were in southeastern California, and many of the foundations of pathfindering, the familiar triangular emblem used in worldwide Pathfinder fairs, camporees, the Pathfinder song, all got their start right here in the West. These are just a handful of the milestones that have marked our pathway forward here in the Pacific Southwest. Just a glimpse, really, of how we've been led by the Holy Spirit and have experienced the abundant grace of God. One last story of Ellen White, that amazing woman we love to call Sister. James and Ellen White first visited California in the winter of 1872, and they made California their winter home until James passed away in 1881. Healdsburg remained home for Sister White until she moved to Australia in 1891. In 1900, Ellen White returned to the United States and to California and found a home at Elmshaven, just outside of St. Helena and down the hill from the sanitarium. It would become her home for the rest of her life. And here she prepared some of her most popular and important books and wrote hundreds of articles and messages. Elmshaven is now owned by the Pacific Union Conference. Hundreds of people visit it each year and are inspired to learn more about Sister White's life and ministry. I hope you've enjoyed this whirlwind tour through our history. Do you have a favorite story about God's leadership in your church or school? If you share it with us, we'll try to find a way to tell it on a future All God's People or in some of our digital and print media. The program bulletin has information about how to get in touch with us. All these stories and so many others, including your own story of God's providence and care, remind us of words from the pen of inspiration that I referred to at the beginning, and that have become so familiar to Adventists throughout the world. We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and His teaching in our past history. For all God's people in the Pacific Union, thanks for joining us for this journey into our past. I hope you'll join us again next week.